Hello, artist! It's Kelly Folsom here, and I want to welcome you back to another Art Life Conversations podcast. And today I wanted to talk to all of you about building a visual vocabulary. So, this conversation is going to be on focused on technique and how to improve your technical ability whenever it comes to painting in particular. But you could also apply this really to any medium, whether that is sculpture or drawing or anything like that. So one thing that I think many artists don't realize whenever they get started, like myself, is that there is a very specific way to solve problems in painting, a very specific kind of visual vocabulary to painting that really has very little to do with what we see necessarily, or copying what we see, or based on the reality of how we see, or even how a photograph records a person, place, or thing, right? So this is really, once you really get this, once you really build this visual vocabulary for yourself and you really understand it, you will have so much more success in your art, in the quality of your art. So I know for me, whenever I first got started in art, I mostly did drawing at the time, and I would just try to render what I was seeing. I would just try to duplicate and copy what I saw, whether that was copying a photograph. At the time, I was doing a lot of drawing portraits from photos, and I would often get dissatisfied with the end result because while I had copied the photo reasonably well, it still looked amateur, and it still looked very flat, very two-dimensional, not very three-dimensional at all, and there really wasn't a strong design to the drawings. So I knew something was missing, some piece of understanding was missing, but I didn't really understand what that was. And that's where a lot of artists are, and it's where a lot of artists stay in their development, is just getting like a sort of a mediocre or a less than mediocre rendering of the thing, of the real life thing, whenever you're doing representational art, but it doesn't really have that quality to it that you might see, for example, going to a museum, looking at really wonderful art hanging in the museum. There's always a difference between the two types of art, and I feel like this is really the secret to achieving that quality of art, is really developing your visual vocabulary and an understanding of that visual language. So painting, it really is, oddly in a way, like learning a foreign language. There are aspects to it that the everyday person and also new starting out artists just can't grasp. They don't understand. They're not aware. It's really a lot of it is really an awareness to understand that language and that vocabulary. So for me, this takes a long time to build. I don't want to say a long time, because I feel like I built it, within the first 5 or 6 years of studying art. But it took a really long time for it to really click, for me to really get it, for me to really see it and really get it. So it's taken a long time, and it's taken a lot of immersion in art and studying art. And so that's really what I wanted to talk to you all about today, is making sure that you are making the investment in trying to understand that visual vocabulary by studying art. So often what ends up happening is artists will just get stuck in that copying and rendering phase. And they can get pretty good at the rendering, and then people will, congratulate them and say, oh, great job. That looks just like a photo or something like that. And it's because they've really learned how to render. Some people get, much better at this than others. And, kind of being almost like a photocopier, like they can kind of photocopy reality and all of the details and all of the little bumps and bruises and nuances that they might see, for example, on a piece of fruit. But if you were to hang one of their works up in the museum next to, let's say, a high quality work of art at the museum, you would see that there's like a really big difference in quality between the works. And it's really just, I don't even want to use the word quality maybe, but it's a big difference between the understanding and the perceptions. So there's that old saying that every piece of art is basically a self-portrait of the artist. It really is a reflection of the artist and what they understand, how much they grasp about art making, to whatever degree that may be. And of course, also like what interests them. Obviously, it's a self-portrait in that way too. So it took me a really, really long time to really get this this art making language, this painting language, the painting vocabulary. So, and it really does have, it does have something to do with real life and reality, but also it has this whole other side to it that is only shows up in painting. So, and what it has to do with, of course, is like shapes, how we organize the shapes, of course, what the paint will or will not do, learning what those things are, composition, understanding how to compose an image on a two-dimensional surface. And so really one of the main ways that we do this is by studying the artist who understood that painting language, that visual vocabulary that came before us, and really building that. So, recently Monty and I were talking because we have been going out and doing a lot of plein air painting. And, he's much more kind of a detail-oriented person, so he was really struggling doing some plein air painting with me. And so we got to talking about it, and I said, well, I think, really the thing is like you have to have sort of this visual data bank. It really is almost like a visual database of landscape paintings in your mind, right? Like of, past artists who have painted past landscapes. And in a way, it's like this visual record of how they solved problems in paint, right? So, and there's so much that we can learn from these paintings. Of course, it's beneficial, to take classes, to study from contemporary artists and, listen to their videos or hear them teach. And all of that is incredibly useful and helpful as well. But one way that I have really built my skill set, both with still life and with landscape painting, is by just going to those paintings, going to those images, poring over them, spending so much time, trying to understand why they did what they did. Why did they place this here? Why does that look so dimensional? Why does that have so much depth? The illusion of depth, because there is no depth on a two-dimensional painting, right? So, and also sometimes not even purposefully analyzing, but really taking the works in as a student, almost on like a subconscious kind of sponge-like level, like just staring at the art, just taking it in, absorbing it in, almost like memorizing it in a way. Sometimes I am more conscious, I guess is the word I'm looking, consciously trying to understand, and I'll be searching for answers on purpose or asking questions on purpose. And other times I'm just taking it in as more of like a subconscious kind of sponge-like level. Just observing, that is really the job of the artist in a lot of ways, is really observing that external world and taking it in. But I think more important than just like observing nature is observing art that has come before us. So every now and then, sometimes I'll be talking to students and I'll mention an artist's name, and I'll say, well, for example, do you know who Canaletto is? Or if it's not like a big name like Van Gogh or something like that, sometimes they might not know who that artist is. And so, of course, that's part of what I try to do in my teaching as well, is try to expose the students to this art history, because really learning from art history, learning from these artists who came before us hundreds and hundreds of years ago, especially for representational art, especially pre-modernism, because so much of the language broke down after modernism and was lost. A lot of the tools, a lot of the techniques, a lot of the understanding was really lost after, let's say modernist art came on the scene. So it's one thing that I'm always trying to do with the artists who are in my Vital Art Sessions program or in the mastermind, is really help them to understand this visual language, which is really all about, the organization of this two-dimensional surface, of this rectangle or this square. How are you organizing the shapes, the sizes, the colors, the values? How are you organizing your edges? How are you using hard and soft edges to create depth and atmosphere and space, in that illusion of three-dimensionality? How are you using your paint quality to create a focus or texture, to represent the illusion of all the different textures that we are trying to capture in still life or in landscape. So it's really, we are trying to get the illusion of reality, and we are observing nature, but we're also trying to understand what the languages of painting, of what the laws of painting are, what works in painting, what works with oil paint versus acrylic paint, or versus watercolor, because every medium versus pastel, every medium has some pros and cons to it, some constraints and limitations to it. So really looking at all of this art that has come before us and really studying it, what I find is that too many artists are just looking at other contemporary artists, or they're not looking at other good art at all. They're just making their own art, and they're just rendering, copying from life, and their work is really more lower quality because of that, lower level, right? So today, I just really, this one is like short and sweet, but I really want to challenge you, if you are not studying from the past artists who have come before us. It doesn't even have to, you don't even have to go all the way back to Michelangelo, let's say, for example. But I mean, study Michelangelo, study Sorolla, study Sargent, take it in. And I would say also study. Don't just be enamored with the art, or just, there's a difference whenever we are looking at art from like a consumer point of view, as the audience and just enjoying it. Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful, and oh, I love this painting. There's a difference between that and looking at the art from an artist perspective, from a student point of view, of really trying to understand for yourself, like, what are they doing that is working? Like, and it's really helpful sometimes to find similar subjects or similar scenes that you like to paint. So this is another thing that I've always done throughout my art career, is whenever I'm really trying to improve on something, I will compare my current work to some of these artists' work. I'll try to find something that's similar. If I'm painting a seascape, then I'll start poring over seascape paintings, historical seascape paintings. And I'll just compare the two side by side, to see, what am I missing anything? Am I missing anything about this particular subject or this particular genre? Or, is there anything that I am not seeing as clearly when it comes to that visual, language? And so this is something that's been so helpful to me as well, not just doing the studying of the art, but then also after I do my own independent work, like comparing my independent work to theirs to see, was there anything else that I could have added in terms of any new tools, any new problem solving techniques that I could have, that I can see, from comparing these two together. Instead of just just doing our own work and then just going, okay, that's done, set it aside, moving on to the next painting, So these are strategies or methodologies that I've used to really improve my understanding of painting, because it does have its own language, it does have its vocabulary, and it has very little to do with copying, reality with just rendering. So today, I just want to encourage all of you to make sure that you're taking the time to do that in your own way, and then also hold your work up to the mirror of the masters of the past, to see what it is that you might be missing, where you can improve. And of course, you can hold it up to contemporary artists as well, but you want to, sometimes with contemporary artists, it's difficult to find somebody who is not just a really good renderer or a really good copier, and someone who is really using the language of paint. So for example, just to give you a small example, for me, whenever I was coming up and learning, somebody who I used to look at a lot was, David Laffelle's work. And so there was one day whenever I did this comparison, a painting I was working on, and I had brought it near completion. And so I took a photograph of it, and then I compared it to a few of his paintings. And one thing that struck out immediately to me in the comparison was his use of reflected light, and how his use of reflected light in his shadows really made the whole painting feel so much more lit up. And that was not something that I was actually seeing, even with a strong spotlight on my setup. It's like I might have saw a little bit of reflected light, but it really wasn't that strong or that intense or that dramatic. And so what I noticed, so I just studied that. I studied how much reflected light he was putting into his form shadows. I noticed where he was putting it in. I analyzed why, he's putting it mostly in the underplane here because the light on the table is bouncing up, or he's putting it in on the right-hand side where another object that's bright is, throwing more reflection into it. But and then I realized, he's doing that and he's not losing. However, he never loses the core shadow where the shadow starts. And also I noticed, the reflected light never comes up to the same coolness or opacity or brightness of color as what is in the light piece. So even just learning that about the language of painting, that that there is a shape of light and there's a shape of shadow, and that there's two different, totally different rules to how you paint. I hate using that word rules, but basically laws of nature and laws of oil paint, that there's two totally different ways that you paint that shape of light versus that shape of shadow. And then also just building your visual database in terms of, for example, with plein air, whenever I'm going out and doing plein air, I have to, in that case, we're not setting everything up ourselves like in still life. So whenever I go out and do plein air, I really have to take my time and look around, and until I see a scene that I can really see it in paint. Like maybe it's not even that special, maybe it doesn't really look that special or that beautiful that day. Maybe it's just like a field and here's some trees and some sky. But having that visual database of past artist work, like for example, like George Inness, Thomas Moran, Albert Bierstadt, all of these really fabulous, great landscape painters of, the 19th, 20th century, because I do have a strong database of images in my mind for that, then a lot of times what will happen is I will see a scene that's like, oh, it'll trigger that. Oh my gosh, yes, I kind of remember this George Inness painting that had a similar feeling to the light, or the angles of the clouds are so it's like all of a sudden the brain starts firing and lighting up and making all these connections. So it's like you kind of have to have this database downloaded in your brain. And again, this is a lifelong thing. But you kind of have to have that database in order for those connections to fire more. And then, of course, the more that I can see what the painting could look like in its totality as a painting, not as a copy of the scene, but if I can really visualize it as the finished painting, the more and more success I will have in that painting, regardless of my current skill level in rendering. Because your rendering will develop and will grow and get better over time, or your accuracy, however you want to word that, your technical proficiency. But really having this strong database in place will help you to get more successful results regardless of where you're at with your technical proficiency. So I want to encourage all of you, start doing research, start studying the historical artists who have come before us, start trying to understand that visual vocabulary and the language of painting, and building that database for yourself. It will pay off 1,000 times. Okay, everybody, I'm wishing you all happy painting, and I will see you next week. Bye.